At a charity gala, a millionaire humiliated his black fiancée in front of 300 guests, calling her a childless gold digger with no legacy. She didn't argue. She simply vanished. 6 years later, she walked into his boardroom as his new boss and said, "Good to see you again, Mr. Hayes. I'll be your new boss." What he didn't know, she was carrying his twin sons the night he destroyed her. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. John Stories. May the Almighty bless every woman watching with unshakable strength, with peace that drowns out every insult, and with victories so sweet they silence every voice that ever doubted you. You are resilient, you are powerful, and your comeback will always be greater than your setback. But family, I need your help. YouTube is hiding our stories from those who need them most. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. If you believe in second chances and divine justice, comment, "I stand with Mr. John Stories." This is Mission 1000 likes, not for me, but for every woman who's been called worthless and came back priceless. Are you with me? Now, let's dive into the story, family. 3 years earlier, Ava had been nobody Julian's world would notice. She worked 70-hour weeks between graduate school and a downtown cafe, her burgundy apron perpetually smelling like espresso, and her notebooks filled with business models she studied during the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m. Her mother cleaned offices in the financial district. Her father had died when she was 9, leaving behind medical debt that taught Ava exactly how fragile security could be. She understood hunger, not the kind wealthy people claimed when they skipped lunch for a meeting, but the kind that made you calculate whether eating today meant paying rent tomorrow. Julian walked into her cafe on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and regret. His $5,000 suit was soaked through, his hands shaking, and something about the lost expression on his face made Ava grab a clean towel before he said a word. "Rough day." She handed it to him, and he looked at her like she'd offered salvation instead of terry cloth. "My father just told me I'm not smart enough to run the family company." His laugh was bitter. Apparently vision doesn't matter when you're the disappointing son. They talked for 4 hours. Julian bought 7 cups of coffee he didn't drink, while Ava wiped down tables that didn't need cleaning, both of them circling the loneliness that came from being unseen by the people who should see you most. He came back Wednesday, then Thursday. By Saturday, Ava realized she was falling for a man whose world existed in a completely different atmosphere from hers. But Julian made her believe oxygen worked the same everywhere. "You're brilliant," he told her one night, reading over a business pitch she'd written for class. "This is better than anything my father's consultants produce, and they charge $20,000 per analysis." When Julian's tech startup secured Series B funding 8 months later, Ava had proofread every investor deck, talked him through panic attacks at 3 a.m., and reminded him why his vision mattered when his family called it worthless. The company hit $50 million in valuation within a year. Julian bought a penthouse, hired a personal assistant, and started appearing in Forbes features that called him a visionary disruptor. He credited Ava in private over intimate dinners where he held her hand and called her his foundation. In public, during interviews and conference panels, he thanked his team, his investors, and his father's initial skepticism for motivating him. Ava noticed. She told herself it was professional discretion, that you didn't mix personal relationships with business narratives, even when your personal relationship had saved the business from collapsing. The proposal happened at Le Bernardin, Julian on one knee, with a ring that cost more than Ava's entire 4 years of undergraduate tuition. Photographers appeared from nowhere. The moment went viral. Tech millionaire proposes to cafe barista. The headline screamed. And Ava tried not to notice how every article emphasized what she'd been rather than who she was. Margaret Hayes introduced herself at Sunday brunch 3 days later, her Chanel suit impeccable, her smile glacial. How charming that Julian's found someone so refreshingly unpolished. Margaret's eyes traveled from Ava's natural curls to her department store dress with the precision of a surgeon identifying exactly where to cut. "I do hope you understand that infatuation fades, dear, but breeding lasts forever." Ava's grip tightened on her mimosa glass. "I'm not sure I follow, Mrs. Hayes." "Of course you don't." Margaret's laugh was wind chimes made of razor blades. That's precisely my point. Julian said nothing. Just cut his eggs Benedict into smaller and smaller pieces, while his mother explained how Hayes' men had always married women from old money families, how legacy required careful curation, how love was a lovely accessory, but hardly a foundation for dynasty building. Ava excused herself to the bathroom and cried silently into Egyptian cotton hand towels that probably cost more than her monthly rent, then fixed her makeup and returned with a smile that hurt her face. She would prove Margaret wrong through sheer excellence. She learned which fork to use for oysters. She memorized the genealogy of every major family in their social circle. She took ballroom dancing lessons and studied wine regions and transformed herself into someone who could navigate their world without losing herself completely. Margaret's contempt only sharpened. At the engagement party, she cropped Ava out of the family photos. At the charity auction, she introduced Julian to Elena Whitmore 3 times, each introduction more pointed than the last. At Thanksgiving dinner, she asked when Ava planned to stop working. Since Hayes' wives focused on family rather than careers, and surely Ava wanted children soon given her age. The fertility struggles started 4 months before the gala. Ava's period arrived like clockwork, destroying hope with mechanical efficiency every 28 days. Julian grew colder with each negative test, his touches becoming obligatory, his conversations shrinking to logistics and schedules. He stopped asking about her day. He stopped looking at her during sex, which became less about connection and more about checking a box labeled trying. Maybe we're forcing something that isn't meant to happen, he said one night, scrolling through his phone while she lay beside him wondering when she'd become background noise in her own engagement. Ava heard the real message underneath his careful words. Maybe you're defective. Maybe this is a sign. Maybe my mother was right about breeding matching. She scheduled one final appointment with Dr. Keisha Chun, a fertility specialist whose research Ava had discovered during a desperate 3 a.m. internet dive. Dr. Chun reviewed her file with fresh eyes and a frown that gradually transformed into excitement. Every other doctor missed this. Dr. Chin pulled up test results on her screen. Your hormone levels are actually excellent. You're responding beautifully. I'd like to try a different protocol, something targeted. She leaned forward. Ava, your chances are exceptional. I'd say we're looking at high probability, potentially even multiples. Ava left that appointment with medications she hid in her makeup bag and a calendar marked with injection times Julian would never see. She endured the hormonal chaos alone, the mood swings and physical discomfort and desperate hope, wanting to surprise him with success rather than burden him with another potential failure. 6 weeks later, 2 pink lines appeared on a drugstore test she took in a coffee shop bathroom during her lunch break. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it into the toilet. She bought 3 more tests from 3 different pharmacies, each one confirming the impossible. The ultrasound 2 weeks later revealed something even more extraordinary. Twins. The technician's voice was warm, both looking strong and healthy. Congratulations. Ava stared at the screen, at 2 tiny flickering heartbeats that proved every cruel assumption wrong, and started planning how to tell Julian. She imagined his face lighting up, his arms around her, his whispered apologies for doubting. She bought tiny shoes, 1 pair blue, 1 pair gray. She made dinner reservations at the restaurant where they'd had their first real date. She practiced the words in her mirror until they sounded perfect. But Margaret moved faster than love ever could. The spring charity gala had been on the calendar for months, a glittering event where Manhattan's elite paid thousands per plate to feel philanthropic, while photographers documented their generosity. Ava wore an emerald gown that cost 3 months of her old salary, her hair styled in elegant waves, her makeup flawless. She looked successful, polished, exactly like someone who belonged in Julian's world. Margaret seated her at table 17, far from the family table where Julian sat between his mother and Elena Whitmore, whose pedigree included railroad money and a great-grandmother who'd been a Vanderbilt. Ava watched Julian laugh at Elena's jokes, saw him lean close during conversations, and felt the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. When Margaret approached the microphone after the third course, Ava assumed it was another fundraising pitch. The ballroom fell silent, 300 faces turning toward the stage where Margaret stood bathed in spotlight, her smile benevolent and poisonous. "I want to take a moment to address something deeply personal," Margaret began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd mastered weaponizing sympathy. "Because I believe in honesty, in facing difficult truths with grace and dignity." Ava's stomach dropped. Some women are blessed with the ability to provide legacy, to carry forward the bloodlines that built this city, this country. Margaret's eyes found Ava across the ballroom. And some women, despite their best efforts and intentions, simply cannot fulfill that fundamental role. It must be devastating to face such limitations, to watch your partner's dreams of fatherhood die because your body has failed its most basic purpose. The words landed like physical blows. Cameras turned toward Ava. Whispers erupted. Someone's champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. I think we should all acknowledge how difficult this must be for dear Ava, who despite her many other qualities, cannot give my son the family he deserves, the legacy his position demands. Margaret's smile could have frozen oceans. Perhaps it's time we stop pretending love conquers all when biology has made its verdict clear. Ava's vision tunneled. Her hands moved to her stomach where her sons grew, where Julian's legacy lived in secret, and she understood with devastating clarity that he'd known this speech was coming. Julian sat motionless at the family table, his face pale but silent, and his silence spoke louder than his mother's cruelty ever could. Would you forgive the man who let his mother destroy you in front of the world, or would you disappear and take everything he wanted most? Ava didn't cry. That would come later, in the sterile silence of a rural motel 200 miles away. But in the moment Margaret's words detonated across the ballroom, Ava simply stood and walked toward the exit with her head high and her hand protecting the secrets growing inside her. The crowd parted like she carried something contagious, their designer gowns and rented tuxedos pressing against marble columns to avoid contact with her humiliation. Phones emerged from clutches and pockets, recording her exit for social media dissection, and Ava heard the distinct sound of her life being uploaded to the internet in real time. "Ava, wait." Julian's voice cut through the whispers, and she stopped because some part of her still wanted him to fix this, to defend her, to prove Margaret wrong in front of everyone who mattered. He reached her near the coat check, his face flushed, his hand reaching for her arm like they were still people who touched each other with affection instead of obligation. "That was completely out of line," Julian said, his voice low enough that the photographers clustering nearby couldn't hear. "My mother had no right to air our private struggles like that. I'll talk to her." Ava stared at the man she'd supported through his darkest failures, the man whose children were currently dividing cells inside her body, and realized he was more concerned about his mother's breach of etiquette than the destruction of Ava's dignity. He wasn't apologizing for the content of Margaret's speech, just the venue. "You knew," Ava said quietly. "You knew she was going to say something tonight. That's why you've been avoiding me all week. That's why you seated me at table 17 instead of beside you where your fiancé belongs." Julian's silence confirmed everything. "How long have you been planning to end this?" Ava pulled the engagement ring from her finger, the 4-carat diamond catching light from the chandeliers overhead. "Before or after you decided I was defective?" "Don't be dramatic." Julian's jaw tightened. "You're upset, which is understandable, but let's discuss this privately instead of making another scene." Another scene, as if Ava had orchestrated her own public execution instead of being the target of it. She placed the ring in his palm, her fingers steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Tell your mother she won," Ava said. "Tell her the childless gold digger is leaving before she contaminates the Hayes legacy any further." She turned before Julian could respond, before she could change her mind, before the tears building behind her eyes could betray how completely he'd shattered her. The photographers surged forward, shouting questions about the broken engagement and whether the fertility rumors were true and how it felt to be rejected by Manhattan royalty. Ava kept walking through the lobby, past the doorman who wouldn't meet her eyes, into the March cold that bit through her evening gown like judgment. The video went viral within an hour. Someone had captured Margaret's entire speech and Ava's silent exit, editing it with dramatic music and captions that called it the most savage breakup of the year. By midnight, hashtags were trending. By morning, tabloids had constructed elaborate narratives about Ava's supposed infertility and Julian's brave decision to prioritize legacy over love. Think pieces appeared analyzing whether successful men had obligations to marry women who could provide heirs. Margaret gave an interview to Page 6 expressing sympathy for Ava's condition while praising Julian's maturity in making difficult choices. Nobody asked Ava for her side of the story because women like her didn't get to write the narrative when men like Julian decided to erase them. Ava spent that first night in a hotel near JFK Airport, her phone exploding with messages from friends and colleagues and strangers who had opinions about her womb and her worth. She blocked them all, every number except her mother's, and booked a one-way ticket to a town she'd never heard of in upstate New York. She withdrew the maximum cash from her accounts before Julian could freeze them out of spite or Margaret could find ways to make her disappear more thoroughly. She packed a single suitcase with clothes that didn't smell like her old life and documents that proved she existed before Julian Hayes had noticed her. At 4 a.m., sitting in the airport terminal surrounded by travelers who had destinations instead of escape plans, Ava felt her phone buzz with a text from Julian. We should talk about this rationally. You're throwing away everything we built over one bad night. Don't be stupid. One bad night. As if years of Margaret's cruelty and his complicity had condensed into a single evening instead of metastasizing slowly across their entire relationship. Ava deleted the message and turned off her phone, cutting the last thread connecting her to the man who'd called her stupid for having self-respect. The flight attendant who checked her boarding pass noticed Ava's swollen eyes and brought her extra tissues without being asked, a small kindness that made Ava's careful composure crack just slightly. Bad breakup? The attendant asked gently. Something like that, Ava whispered, her hand moving to her stomach where Julian's sons were growing, where his legacy was becoming hers alone. The plane lifted into dawn light, carrying Ava away from everything she'd built and toward a future she'd have to construct from absolute zero. And she made herself a promise at 30,000 feet. Julian Hayes would never know about the children he'd called impossible, would never touch the boys his mother had declared she couldn't provide, would never have the chance to damage them the way he damaged her. If Julian wanted to believe her childless, she'd let him live with that lie while she raised his heirs in secret, teaching them that legacy meant character instead of cruelty, that strength came from integrity instead of inheritance. Would you tell a man who humiliated you that you're carrying his children, or would you let him believe the lie his mother spread while you disappeared forever? The town of Millbrook existed in the kind of obscurity wealthy people never noticed, a place where nobody recognized Ava's face from viral videos or cared about Manhattan scandals that felt like fiction from another planet. She rented a cabin 15 minutes outside town using cash and a fake name, telling the elderly landlord she was a writer seeking solitude, which wasn't entirely false, since Ava spent her first week rewriting every assumption she'd ever made about love and loyalty, and what happened when you trusted men who let their mothers weaponize your pain. The cabin smelled like pine and old wood smoke, its isolation so complete that Ava could scream without anyone hearing, which she did exactly once before deciding that rage required more productive channels than echo. Dr. Yemi Okonkwo ran the only medical clinic within 30 miles, a no-nonsense Nigerian woman who'd left a prestigious Boston hospital to practice rural medicine after her daughter died in a car accident on a country road with no nearby trauma center. She examined Ava without judgment, her questions direct, and her hands gentle during the ultrasound that confirmed both babies were thriving despite their mother's recent trauma. Twins are resilient, Dr. Okonkwo said, pointing to the screen where two perfect heartbeats pulsed in synchronization. But mothers need to be resilient too. Are you safe here? Is someone looking for you? Ava hesitated, then shook her head. Nobody's looking. I made sure of that. Good. Dr. Okonkwo printed images of the ultrasound and handed them to Ava like precious documents. Then we focus on keeping all three of you healthy. I'll see you every 2 weeks, and if you need anything beyond medical care, my number is on that card. Day or night understood. The kindness nearly broke Ava's carefully maintained composure, but she nodded and left before tears could make her vulnerable again. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Julian descended into a version of regret that looked more like inconvenience than genuine remorse. He called Ava's phone 17 times the first week, each voicemail progressing from annoyed to concerned to angry that she wouldn't answer. He hired a private investigator who traced her to JFK but lost the trail after she paid cash for everything and used her middle name on the rental agreement. He told friends Ava had overreacted to a misunderstanding, that she'd come back once she calmed down and realized what she was throwing away. Margaret hosted a dinner party 3 weeks after the gala, seating Elena Whitmore beside Julian with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, and Julian went through the motions of charm while wondering why victory felt hollow. He'd gotten exactly what his mother wanted, freedom from a woman whose background embarrassed the Hayes name, but sleep became difficult and work felt meaningless, and sometimes Julian caught himself reaching for his phone to text Ava about something funny before remembering she'd become unreachable. "You did the right thing," Margaret told him over breakfast one Saturday, her approval warming the penthouse like sunlight. "A momentary infatuation isn't worth compromising everything our family built." Elena's great-grandfather helped finance the Brooklyn Bridge. That's the kind of lineage that matters. Julian nodded and felt nothing, which scared him more than grief would have. 4 months after Ava disappeared, Julian's company hit a valuation plateau that confused analysts and worried investors. His presentations lacked the visionary fire that had made him famous. His strategic decisions became reactive instead of innovative, and board members started questioning whether Julian Hayes was a one-hit wonder whose initial success had been luck disguised as genius. His father, who'd barely spoken to Julian since the company launched, appeared at the office unannounced with the kind of smile that preceded hostile takeovers. "Seems you're struggling without your little barista to proofread your thoughts," his father said, examining quarterly reports with visible disappointment. Perhaps Mother was premature in removing her. Diamonds need polishing, but coal has its industrial uses. Julian wanted to defend Ava, to explain that she'd been brilliant and essential and irreplaceable, but doing so would require admitting he'd destroyed something valuable for reasons that felt increasingly stupid. Instead, he nodded and accepted his father's criticism and wondered when he'd become the kind of man who sacrificed people who loved him to please people who never would. Ava gave birth on an October evening when autumn leaves covered the cabin's porch like burgundy snow. Dr. Okonkwo delivered both boys in the bedroom Ava had converted into a temporary delivery room, her steady voice guiding Ava through contractions that felt like her body was splitting apart to create new worlds. Liam arrived first, screaming his arrival with lungs that promised he'd never be silenced, his tiny fists waving like he was already fighting invisible opponents. Levi followed 8 minutes later, quieter but watchful, his dark eyes scanning the room like he was cataloging every detail for future reference. "They're perfect," Dr. Okonkwo said, placing both boys on Ava's chest where they immediately calmed, their breathing synchronizing with hers. Strong and healthy and absolutely perfect. Ava looked at her sons, Julian's sons, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with post-birth hormones and everything to do with purpose crystallizing into unshakable certainty. These boys would never know the father who'd called their mother defective, would never meet the grandmother who'd declared them impossible, would grow up understanding that legacy meant building yourself instead of inheriting someone else's cruelty. "Welcome to the world," Ava whispered, kissing each perfect forehead. "You're going to change everything." She registered them as Liam Carter Thompson and Levi Carter Thompson, using her mother's maiden name and erasing Julian from their documentation entirely. And if some part of her felt guilty about denying him fatherhood, she remembered his silence during Margaret's speech, and the guilt evaporated like morning fog under brutal sunlight. Would you keep your children's secret from the man who destroyed you? Or would you tell him the truth and risk him trying to take them away? 6 years later, Ava Thompson no longer existed, replaced by Dr. Ava Carter, a name that appeared on Forbes 30 Under 30 lists and keynote speaker rosters at technology conferences where venture capitalists fought for 30 seconds of her attention. The transformation hadn't been accidental or easy, built instead through brutal 18-hour days while her son slept in night classes at a state university that didn't care about her past, only her potential. She'd launched her first startup from the cabin's kitchen table, a software platform that helps small businesses optimize inventory using machine learning algorithms. She'd taught herself through MIT's free online courses and sheer determination to prove Margaret Hayes catastrophically wrong about her worth. The first company sold for $12 million within 2 years, and Ava rolled every penny into her second venture, a logistics technology firm that revolutionized supply chain management for mid-sized manufacturers. That one sold for $87 million, and suddenly Ava had the kind of capital that bought more than comfort. It bought power, influence, and the ability to make men like Julian irrelevant. Nova Dynamics emerged from Ava's third company launch, a tech conglomerate specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for enterprise resource planning. And within 3 years, it dominated markets that legacy companies had controlled for decades. Ava hired the best engineers money could recruit, many of them women and immigrants who understood what it meant to be underestimated. And she built a corporate culture where brilliance mattered more than pedigree, where results spoke louder than last names. Liam and Levi grew up in boardrooms disguised as playrooms, their mother teaching them coding basics before they learned multiplication tables, explaining market dynamics through games where they ran lemonade stands that competed against each other using different pricing strategies. They were 6 now, identical except for the small scar on Levi's left eyebrow from a playground fall, both of them sharp and curious, and completely unaware their father existed 300 miles south in a penthouse that felt increasingly empty. "Mom, why don't we have a dad like other kids?" Liam asked one evening during dinner, his fork pushing peas around his plate with the concentration of someone solving complex equations. Ava had prepared for this question since they were born, rehearsing answers that balanced honesty with age-appropriate simplicity. Some families have 2 parents, some have 1. Some have grandparents or aunts or uncles raising children. We're a family of 3, and we're complete exactly as we are. But did we ever have a dad? Levi pressed, his watchful eyes missing nothing as usual. "You had a biological father who isn't part of our lives," Ava said carefully. "That was my choice to protect you. And when you're older, if you want to know more, I'll tell you everything. But right now, what matters is that you're loved, safe, and growing into remarkable humans." Liam nodded, satisfied for the moment. But Ava saw Levi file the information away for future examination, his mind already cataloging questions he'd ask when she deemed him old enough for ugly truths. Meanwhile, Hayes Industries struggled through its 6th consecutive quarter of declining revenue. Julian's once revolutionary company, now a cautionary tale about visionaries who peaked early and coasted on reputation. His father had orchestrated a hostile board takeover 18 months earlier, demoting Julian to figurehead CEO while real decisions happened in meetings he wasn't invited to attend. The tech media that once called him a genius now published think pieces about nepotism and privilege disguising incompetence. And Julian started drinking expensive scotch at lunch because afternoons felt impossible sober. Margaret blamed Ava's departure for Julian's decline, convinced her son had never recovered from losing his muse, though she'd never admit her own role in destroying what she claimed to protect. Elena Whitmore had lasted 6 months before recognizing Julian was mourning someone else. And she'd married a hedge fund manager whose emotional availability didn't require archaeological excavation. What Julian didn't know, what nobody at Hayes Industries suspected, was that Nova Dynamics had been quietly acquiring their debt for the past 8 months, purchasing bonds and loans through shell companies with names that revealed nothing about their ultimate ownership. Ava's CFO, a former Wall Street trader named Zainab Mansour, who'd been forced out of her previous firm for being too competent while female, had orchestrated the acquisitions with surgical precision. "We now control 63% of Hayes Industries' outstanding debt," Zainab reported during a private meeting in Ava's corner office overlooking Lower Manhattan, a view that cost more per month than Ava's entire first-year salary at that cafe where she'd met Julian. "One more acquisition, and we trigger the covenant clauses. They'll have to restructure, which means new management, new board composition, new everything." "How long until they realize what's happening?" Ava asked, though she already knew the answer. They won't, not until it's too late. Zainab smiled like a predator who'd been starving for years and finally spotted prey. Hayes Industries is about to become a subsidiary of Nova Dynamics, and there's nothing Julian Hayes can do to stop it except show up to the meeting where you explain his new reality. Ava stared out at the city that had once rejected her, at the skyline containing the penthouse where Julian probably sat right now, completely unaware that the woman he'd called childless was about to become his boss, and she felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite revenge, but wasn't forgiveness either. Justice, maybe, or simply proof that Margaret Hayes had backed the wrong horse in a race that wasn't finished. If you could secretly buy your ex's company and become his boss, would you reveal yourself immediately or wait until he was completely powerless to stop you? The boardroom at Hayes Industries smelled like desperation, disguised as expensive leather and bergamot air freshener. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of a Manhattan skyline that Julian no longer felt part of, despite his family name being carved into the building's limestone facade. He arrived 15 minutes early for the emergency restructuring meeting, his father's lawyers having explained in clinical terms that Hayes Industries would either accept new management or file for bankruptcy by Friday, and Julian had spent the previous 72 hours trying to identify which competitor had orchestrated their destruction with such calculated precision. The new majority stakeholder requested this meeting personally, his father's lead counsel explained, arranging documents with the efficiency of someone who billed by the minute. They've been acquiring your debt through various entities for months. Quite brilliant, actually, if you appreciate financial strategy over sentiment. Julian didn't appreciate anything except the scotch he'd consumed at breakfast, and the growing certainty that he'd somehow failed at the only thing his family valued, maintaining the empire that defined their identity. His father sat at the far end of the table, refusing to make eye contact, his disappointment so palpable it had its own zip code. Margaret had stayed home, claiming migraines, though everyone knew she couldn't stomach watching the Hayes legacy transfer to strangers. The door opened at exactly 10 a.m., and Zainab Mansour entered first, her tailored navy suit and leather portfolio announcing serious money before she said a word. Julian didn't recognize her, which meant nothing since finance people all looked the same to him, competent and vaguely threatening. She took a seat near the head of the table and smiled the way surgeons probably smiled before particularly complex operations. "Good morning, gentlemen," Zainab said. "The new majority stakeholder will join us momentarily. Before they arrive, I want to clarify that this restructuring is non-negotiable. Hayes Industries will become a wholly owned subsidiary of Nova Dynamics effective immediately. Existing management will be evaluated on merit rather than legacy, and those who cannot adapt to new leadership will be offered generous severance packages." Julian's father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood with a sound like bones breaking. "This is outrageous. You can't simply waltz in and dismantle a company my grandfather founded. We'll fight this in court for decades if necessary." "You could try," Zainab agreed pleasantly. "But Nova Dynamics owns 68% of your outstanding debt, controls your primary vendor relationships through subsidiary partnerships, and has already secured commitments from 73% of your shareholders who are thrilled to finally see competent leadership. You have no leverage, Mr. Hayes. You have only the choice between cooperation and irrelevance." The door opened again, and Julian turned expecting some Silicon Valley tech bro in expensive sneakers and a hoodie, the kind of nouveau riche entrepreneur his mother complained about at dinner parties. But instead he saw a woman in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his car, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that framed a face he'd memorized during 3 years of love and 1 night of destruction. Time didn't stop, that was romantic fiction. But Julian's brain required several seconds to process information that couldn't possibly be accurate because Ava Thompson had disappeared into obscurity after their broken engagement, had vanished so completely his investigators couldn't track her, had become a ghost story Julian told himself when Scotch made him sentimental about the woman he'd sacrificed for family approval that turned out to be worthless. "Hello, Julian," Ava said, her voice carrying none of the softness he remembered, replaced by something that sounded like tempered steel wrapped in silk. "It's been a while." She moved to the head of the table where his father had sat for 40 years, and Julian watched her claim that chair like she'd been born to occupy it, her presence commanding attention that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with power that made his own authority feel like a child's participation trophy. "I'm Dr. Ava Carter, CEO of Nova Dynamics," she continued, her eyes meeting Julian's with the directness of someone who'd stopped fearing his judgment years ago. "As of this morning, I control Hayes Industries. Your company, your legacy, your future. All of it now reports to me." Julian couldn't form words, his mouth opening and closing like he'd forgotten how language functioned. His father looked between them with dawning horror, finally connecting dots that spelled humiliation in every direction. "You," Julian's father breathed. "You're the barista. The one who couldn't." He stopped, perhaps recognizing that finishing that sentence would only deepen their disaster. "Couldn't what, Mr. Hayes?" Ava's smile could have frozen oceans. "Couldn't build a billion-dollar company? Couldn't revolutionize 3 separate industries? Couldn't become the person Julian needed me to be, because I was too busy becoming someone far more valuable." She opened her portfolio, extracted a document, and slid it across the table toward Julian. "This is your new employment contract. You'll report directly to me as Vice President of Strategic Development, a position I'm offering because despite everything, you do have potential that was wasted by people who valued pedigree over performance." Julian stared at the contract like it might explode. "You expect me to work for you? After you disappeared without explanation, after you." "After what, Julian?" Ava's voice remained perfectly calm, but something dangerous flickered behind her eyes. "After I left, because your mother called me barren in front of 300 people, and you sat silent as a monument to cowardice? After you let her destroy me publicly because standing up for me mattered less than maintaining her approval? Please, finish that sentence. I'm fascinated to hear how you've rewritten history in your own mind." The boardroom fell silent except for the hum of expensive air conditioning and Julian's father's labored breathing. Zainab took notes on her tablet, documenting the conversation for legal purposes, and Julian realized with crushing certainty that every word spoken here would become part of official records, his humiliation preserved in corporate archives forever. "You have 48 hours to accept or decline the position," Ava said, standing and collecting her portfolio with movements that suggested she had 12 other places to be, all of them more important than this room. "If you decline, your severance package is outlined in the appendix. Either way, Hayes Industries belongs to me now, and I intend to transform it into something actually worthy of the name." She paused at the door, looking back at Julian with an expression he couldn't read. "I'll be in the office every day if you need time to process this. But don't take too long. Decisive action is a quality I value in my leadership team, and you've already spent 6 years demonstrating the opposite." The door closed behind her, and Julian sat in the ruins of his family's empire, holding a contract that offered him employment in the company his grandfather had built, under the authority of the woman he destroyed. And he understood with devastating clarity that Ava Carter had done something far more brutal than revenge. She'd made him irrelevant, then offered him the chance to become useful again, and somehow that was infinitely worse than simple destruction. Would you accept a job working for the ex who became your boss, or walk away from everything your family built rather than bow to someone you once controlled? The contract sat and signed on Julian's mahogany desk for 36 hours while he rehearsed conversations that would never happen, imagining scenarios where he reclaimed dignity that Ava had systematically dismantled with the precision of someone who'd studied his weaknesses like a doctoral thesis. He signed it at 4 a.m. on the second day, his signature shaky from scotch and the recognition that unemployment offered even less dignity than subordination. And when he arrived at Hayes Industries, now officially a Nova Dynamics subsidiary, security made him wait in the lobby for 20 minutes because his executive access codes had been revoked overnight. A small humiliation that felt like Ava's opening move in a chess game where he'd already lost his queen. "Mr. Hayes, Dr. Carter will see you now," the new receptionist said, a young woman who didn't recognize his family name and therefore treated him like any other middle management employee reporting to corporate. and Julian rode the elevator to the executive floor that his grandfather had designed, finding his old corner office occupied by Zainab Mansour, who smiled at him through glass walls like a general who'd captured enemy territory without firing a shot. Ava's office, his father's office, his grandfather's office, had been completely renovated in 72 hours. The traditional oil paintings replaced with abstract art that probably cost more than his car. The massive oak desk swapped for a sleek glass workstation that made power look effortless rather than inherited. And Ava sat behind it reviewing financial projections like she'd been born to dismantle legacies that men like his father believed were immortal. "You signed," Ava said without looking up, her statement requiring no confirmation because obviously he'd signed or he wouldn't be standing in her office at 8 a.m. wearing the expression of someone who'd chosen survival over pride. "I signed," Julian confirmed, hating how his voice sounded like an apology he hadn't meant to offer. "I want to understand what you expect from me in this position. What strategic development means when the person defining strategy spent 3 years watching me build this company before." He stopped because finishing that sentence led nowhere productive. "Before you let your mother call me Baron at a charity gala while photographers documented my humiliation for social media." Ava's eyes finally met his, and Julian saw something there that wasn't quite hatred, but felt infinitely colder, like the emotional equivalent of absolute zero. Strategic development means you'll identify growth opportunities in markets where Hayes Industries has failed due to leadership that valued tradition over innovation. You'll report your findings to me weekly, and you'll remember that every decision you make requires my approval because trust is something you'll earn over years rather than expect based on history that includes you standing silent while I was destroyed. She slid a folder across her desk. "Your first assignment analyzes why Hayes Industries lost the Patterson medical contract 3 years ago. I want a full report by Friday explaining what went wrong and how we'll prevent similar failures under new management." Julian opened the folder and felt his stomach drop because the Patterson medical contract had been his father's pet project, a deal Julian had advised against because their pricing structure was uncompetitive. But his father had insisted that legacy relationships mattered more than market analysis, and they'd lost $8 million along with their reputation in the medical supply sector. "This wasn't my failure," Julian said, his defensiveness immediate and pathetic. "I told my father the bid was too high. I provided data showing Patterson would go with McAllister Industries instead, but he wouldn't listen because he valued his own judgment over yours, exactly the way you valued your mother's approval over my dignity," Ava interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 6 years preparing for this exact conversation. "So now you'll document that failure comprehensively. You'll identify every decision point where better leadership could have changed outcomes. And you'll present your analysis to our board as evidence that Hayes Industries required outside intervention to survive, which conveniently supports my narrative that this acquisition saved jobs rather than destroyed a legacy." She stood, moving to her window with a kind of grace that came from years of commanding boardrooms where men like Julian had once dismissed her as decorative. "I'm not interested in punishing you, Julian. I'm interested in transforming this company into something valuable. And if you can contribute to that transformation, then your family history becomes irrelevant compared to your current utility. But if you're here hoping I'll eventually soften because we once meant something to each other, then you should resign immediately because that version of me died the night you watched your mother destroy me without saying a single word in my defense. Would you work for someone who's rewriting your family's failures as proof they needed saving, knowing every report you write confirms their narrative while dismantling your father's legacy? Or would pride matter more than survival even when survival is the only option remaining?" Julian carried the folder back to his new office, smaller, interior-facing, decorated with furniture from the previous tenant who'd been fired for incompetence, and started documenting his family's failures for the woman who'd transformed from victim to victor, while he'd spent 6 years believing her disappearance proved his mother right about women who couldn't handle pressure, never imagining that Ava had been building empires in silence, while he'd been inheriting the ruins of arrogance. Disguised as tradition, Julian spent 3 weeks producing reports that documented his family's incompetence with the thoroughness of someone cataloging their own irrelevance, and Ava reviewed each submission with comments that were professionally devastating and personally distant, treating him like a contractor whose work met minimum standards rather than someone who'd once promised her forever before choosing his mother's approval over their future. The Nova Dynamics annual charity gala arrived with the inevitability of Judgment Day, a black tie event at the plaza where Ava would introduce herself to New York's elite as the woman who'd conquer Hayes Industries. And Julian attended because declining would have announced weakness that his new position couldn't afford, his tuxedo feeling like a costume for a role he no longer understood how to play. The ballroom glittered with wealth that considered itself immortal. Old money mixing with tech fortunes, while photographers documented networking that would become tomorrow's business deals. And Julian stood near the bar nursing sparkling water, because Scotch had stopped helping weeks ago, watching Ava command attention from venture capitalists and hedge fund managers who treated her like royalty because money recognized power regardless of its origin story. She wore emerald silk that probably cost more than his monthly salary, her natural hair styled in elegant twists that somehow made everyone else's formal styling look boring by comparison. And Julian felt the familiar ache of wanting something that had transformed so completely he no longer recognized the shape of his own desire. Mommy said we could stay for 1 hour, then Auntie Zainab takes us home, a small voice announced near Julian's elbow. And he looked down to see 2 identical boys around 6 years old, both wearing miniature tuxedos that matched his own, both staring up at him with faces that made Julian's heart stop because he was looking at photographs of himself from childhood. The same deep brown eyes and dimpled chin and slight gap between front teeth that his mother had paid thousands to correct with. Orthodontics. Are you someone important? You look sad like important people do when they have too many meetings. Julian couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at these children who wore his genetics like uniforms while discussing their mother with the casual confidence of boys who'd been raised by someone who actually loved them. Who's your mother? He managed, his voice barely functional. Dr. Carter, the slightly taller twin, said proudly. She's the boss of everything tonight because she donated the most money for kids who don't have houses. And she said that's important because she remembers when she didn't have much money either and people were mean to her, but she built a company anyway. He tilted his head, studying Julian with unsettling perception. You look like the pictures in our baby album. The ones Mommy keeps in her office drawer that she thinks we don't know about. But Levi found them when we were looking for markers, and you were younger with different clothes, but the same face. The ballroom tilted sideways and Julian gripped the bar for support while his brain tried processing information that rewrote 6 years of history with the efficiency of someone hacking into his memories and replacing every file. Your names are Liam and Levi, he asked, remembering conversations with Ava about baby names, how she'd loved those specific names because they meant strong protector, and joined in harmony. And he'd agreed they were perfect for sons he'd never actually believed they could have because his mother had convinced him that Ava's fertility struggles meant she was fundamentally broken. I'm Liam, the taller boy confirmed. That's Levi. He's 3 minutes younger, but he's better at math, so it evens out. He paused, his expression shifting to something that looked disturbingly like pity. Are you going to cry? Adults cry at fancy parties sometimes when they drink the sparkly stuff. Mommy says it's because they're sad about choices they made a long time ago. Julian turned and saw Ava watching from across the ballroom, her face completely unreadable, and he started walking toward her with the single-minded focus of someone who just discovered his entire reality was a lie built on assumptions that had cost him everything worth having. People moved aside as he crossed the space between them, perhaps sensing the emotional devastation radiating from him like radiation from a meltdown. And when he reached Ava, he couldn't form coherent sentences, could only stare at her while his brain screamed questions that his mouth couldn't articulate. They're yours, Ava said quietly, her voice carrying no triumph, just exhausted honesty. Liam and Levi, the sons you said I could never give you, the children your mother called impossible before humiliating me in front of everyone who mattered. She took a breath that suggested this conversation required courage she'd been gathering for weeks. I found out I was pregnant 2 days after the gala, after you'd let her destroy me publicly, and I decided then that my sons would never know a father who values his mother's bigotry over their mother's humanity. So I disappeared and built a life where they'd be protected from people who measure worth by bloodlines rather than character. Would you forgive the person who hid your children for 6 years because you'd proven yourself unworthy of knowing them? Or would the fact that they existed make the betrayal unforgivable regardless of your own failures that caused their concealment? Julian looked back at the twins who were now eating chocolate cake with Zainab, their laughter carrying across the ballroom like evidence of a childhood he'd missed entirely. And he understood with devastating clarity that Ava hadn't just taken his company. She'd taken his family too, except she hadn't taken anything because he'd thrown it away the night he chose silence over defending the woman carrying his sons. Julian didn't sleep for 3 days after discovering his sons existed. His apartment filled with empty coffee cups and browser tabs showing child development milestones for 6-year-olds, trying to calculate everything he'd missed, while Ava had been building both an empire and a family that should have included him if he'd possessed the spine to defend her when defense mattered more than his mother's approval. He showed up at Nova Dynamics headquarters at 6 a.m. on the 4th day, waiting in the lobby until Ava arrived at 7:30. And when she saw him sitting there with the desperate expression of someone who'd lost everything twice, she sighed like she'd been expecting this conversation, but had hoped to delay it indefinitely. "My office," Ava said, not waiting to see if he'd follow, because obviously he'd follow since he had nowhere else to go with the need burning through him like acid. She closed the door behind them and moved to her desk, not sitting, just standing there with her arms crossed like she was preparing for battle. "You have 5 minutes to say whatever you came here to say. And then I have meetings with people who actually contribute to this company's success rather than spending 72 hours stalking my schedule." "I want to know my sons," Julian said, the words tumbling out without the eloquent speech he'd rehearsed 17 times in his bathroom mirror. "I'm not asking to be their father immediately. I'm not demanding rights I clearly haven't earned. I'm just asking for the chance to prove I'm not the same person who failed you 6 years ago. That I can be someone worthy of knowing the children I should have protected before they were even born." He paused, his hands shaking. "I know I don't deserve this. I know every single choice I made proved I was exactly the coward you believed me to be. But they deserve the chance to know their father if I can become someone worth knowing. And I'm begging you to let me try, even though begging is pathetic, and you owe me absolutely nothing." "You're right, I owe you nothing," Ava agreed, her voice sharp enough to cut. "But this isn't about what I owe you. It's about what's best for Liam and Levi. And I spent 6 years building a life where they'd never feel abandoned or unwanted or insufficient because their father valued appearances over substance." She moved to her window, her back to Julian. "My sons are brilliant and kind and secure in ways I never was at their age. And introducing you into their lives means risking that security, because what happens when you decide being a father is harder than you imagined. What happens when your mother poisons them with her bigotry? What happens when you choose your legacy over their well-being exactly like you chose it over mine?" The door burst open before Julian could answer, and Margaret Hayes stood there in Chanel and fury, her face twisted with the kind of rage that came from discovering her carefully constructed world had been demolished by someone she'd dismissed as irrelevant. "You conniving witch," Margaret hissed at Ava, her voice carrying through the open door to where assistants pretended not to listen. "You trapped my son with pregnancy, and now you're blackmailing him with children who probably aren't even his. And I've contacted every media outlet in New York to expose your fraud before you destroy what's left of the Hayes name with your calculated revenge scheme." "Mother, stop," Julian said, his voice harder than he'd ever used with her. "You need to leave immediately before you make this exponentially worse than it already is." "Worse." Margaret laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Worse than discovering my son has illegitimate children with a woman I specifically warned him was using him for money and status? I've already spoken to Gerald Hutchinson at the Tribune. He's running a story tomorrow about how this opportunistic gold digger disappeared after failing to trap you properly, then returned years later claiming you fathered her children to extort both money and company control." She turned to Ava with venomous satisfaction. "By Friday, everyone will know exactly what you are, and Nova Dynamics will collapse under the weight of scandal. that proves you built your empire on lies and manipulation." Ava smiled, and Julian recognized that expression from boardroom negotiations where she'd already won, but was letting her opponent finish embarrassing themselves. "Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate your commitment to destroying me. It's almost touching in its consistency. But you should know that I've already provided the Tribune with comprehensive documentation of Liam and Levi's birth certificates listing Julian as their father, medical records from the fertility treatments I underwent during our engagement, and a rather compelling timeline showing I left immediately after your public humiliation rather than staying to extort anyone." She pulled out her phone, tapped twice, and turned the screen toward Margaret. "I've also released a statement to all major outlets explaining that I built Nova Dynamics as a single mother after leaving an engagement where I was racially abused by my fiancé's family. And the public response has been overwhelmingly supportive based on the 17,000 comments calling you a racist grandmother who doesn't deserve to know her own grandchildren. Would you stand up to your mother to protect the woman and children she tried to destroy, knowing it means choosing between the family you were born into and the family you abandoned? Or would years of conditioning make defiance impossible even when you finally understand what's worth fighting for?" Margaret's face went white as she read the screen, her carefully constructed narrative dissolving into the reality that social media had already convicted her based on evidence that made sympathy impossible. And Julian stepped between them with the clarity of someone who'd finally located his spine after 6 years of searching. "You're done, Mother," Julian said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "You're done controlling my decisions, done poisoning my relationships, done pretending your bigotry represents family values worth protecting." He turned to Ava. "I'll do whatever you require to prove I'm not her, that I can be the father Liam and Levi deserve. And if that takes years, then I'll spend years demonstrating that I finally learned what matters." Ava made Julian wait 6 weeks before allowing supervised visits with Liam and Levi. 6 weeks during which he attended therapy sessions that documented his journey from entitled heir to someone capable of accountability. And when she finally agreed to let him meet the twins formally as their father, she established rules that made prison visitation seem relaxed by comparison. The first meeting happened at a park on a Saturday morning with Zainab present as mediator, and Julian arrived 30 minutes early wearing jeans and a polo shirt because Ava had specifically said not to dress like he was attending a board meeting, that his sons needed to see him as a person rather than a corporate executive playing dress-up as a father. "Boys, this is Julian Hayes," Ava said when they arrived, her hand resting protectively on Levi's shoulder. "He's someone who knew me a long time ago, and he's going to spend some time with us today, if that's okay with you both." Liam studied Julian with the intensity of someone conducting a scientific evaluation. "You're the man from the party who looked sad, the one in our baby album pictures," he said, his statement requiring no confirmation, because obviously he'd already connected every dot that adults thought they'd hidden. "Mommy said you're our biological father, but that father is a word people earn through actions rather than just genetics, and that we'd meet you when you were ready to understand what being a father actually means instead of just wanting to claim us like trophies." Julian knelt down to their eye level, his throat tight with emotions that therapy had taught him to name, but not necessarily control. "Your mom is right, and I'm not here to claim anything or demand you call me dad or pretend we have a relationship I haven't earned," he said, his voice steady despite the fact that his entire future depended on 6-year-olds deciding he was worthy of their time. "I'm here because I made terrible choices 6 years ago that hurt your mother and meant I missed knowing you existed. And I want the chance to prove I can do better, that I can be someone you might eventually want in your life, but only if that's something you both choose rather than something forced on you because of biology." "What kind of terrible choices?" Levi asked with the directness of someone too young to understand diplomatic silence. "Did you steal money or hurt people or lie about important things?" "I stayed silent when someone hurt your mother with words designed to destroy her dignity, and my silence was worse than if I'd said those words myself because it meant I valued other people's approval more than defending someone I claimed to love," Julian answered, and Ava's eyes widened slightly because apparently she hadn't expected honesty that complete. "I let fear and weakness control my choices, and by the time I understood what I'd lost, your mother had built an entirely new life where she didn't need me or anyone else to validate her worth." The twins looked at each other in that way siblings communicated without words, having entire conversations through expressions that adults couldn't interpret, and Liam finally shrugged. "We can teach you how to skip rocks," he said. "Mommy's not very good at it because she's busy running companies, but Auntie Zainab showed us the technique, and we're basically experts now. So if you want to learn, we could show you. And then maybe later we could get ice cream if you're not allergic to dairy or trying to impress us by pretending to like flavors you actually hate." Would you accept a tentative connection with children who've been taught to measure people by their actions rather than their promises, knowing that every interaction is an audition for a role you desperately want but might never truly deserve? Julian spent 3 hours learning to skip rocks with varying degrees of failure, while his sons offered encouragement mixed with brutal honesty about his technique. And when Ava finally said it was time to go, Levi hugged him briefly before running to the car, a gesture so casual it meant everything to someone who'd been starving for connection he'd thrown away before it existed. "They like you," Ava said after the twins were out of earshot, her voice carrying something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but felt closer to peace than Julian had any right to expect. "Liam told me last night that he thought you seemed sad in a way that means you're trying to be better rather than sad in a way that means you blame everyone else, which is apparently a distinction they've learned from watching me build a company, while refusing to become bitter about the past." "I don't deserve this chance," Julian said, watching his sons argue about ice cream flavors through the car window. "No, you don't," Ava agreed. "But they deserve a father who's willing to earn the title rather than demand it through genetics or legal rights. And I've decided that denying them that opportunity to punish you means I'm still letting your choices control my life, and I'm done giving you that power." She turned toward her car, then paused. "You'll see them every Saturday for 3 hours supervised, until I decide you've proven consistency. And if you miss a single visit or show up late or demonstrate that your convenience matters more than their stability, we're done permanently because I will always choose their well-being over your redemption arc." Julian stood in the park watching Ava drive away with the sons who might eventually call him Dad if he spent years proving he'd finally learned what mattered. And he understood that she'd given him something infinitely more valuable than forgiveness. She'd given him accountability wrapped in second chances, the opportunity to become worthy rather than simply demanding to be accepted despite his failures. 6 months later, Julian stood in Ava's office with a different kind of report. Documentation showing Hayes Industries had exceeded quarterly projections under his restructured strategic development division. And when Ava reviewed his work, she smiled with professional approval that felt better than romantic love ever had, because it was earned through competence rather than granted through chemistry. "The boys want you at Levi's Science Fair next week," Ava mentioned casually while signing off on his budget proposal. "Apparently you're acceptable at helping with volcano projects, even though your baking soda ratios need work." Do you think Ava should have taken Julian back romantically, or was giving him a chance, as a co-parent, the perfect revenge, that proved strength isn't about destroying people who failed you, but about building something better from the ruins they created? Julian left her office with supervised visits that had evolved into unsupervised weekends, with twins who called him Julian, but occasionally slipped and said Dad when excited about projects they'd built together. And he recognized that Ava had accomplished something far more devastating than simple revenge. She'd made him irrelevant to her happiness, while giving him the tools to become relevant to his sons' lives, proving that the best way to win wasn't destroying your enemies, but succeeding so completely that their approval became meaningless compared to the empire you built while they weren't watching. So tell me, family, would you have taken him back? Would you let your ex meet the children they didn't know existed? Or would you keep them away forever? Drop your answer in the comments. But first, if you believe people reap what they sow, subscribe to Mr. John Stories. If you believe in women who turn pain into empires, subscribe. If you think Margaret Hayes got exactly what she deserved, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to see that karma never forgets an address. This isn't just a channel, it's a family where we celebrate resilience, accountability, and divine justice. Don't be a silent watcher. Subscribe, comment, and let's grow this movement together. See you in the next one, family. God bless.